Okay, welcome. Thank you for attending the last panel of Mobile World Congress America's Everything Policy Track. We've got a really great panel lined up for you. We spent a couple days now talking about the future of 5G and how spectrum and infrastructure policy is really going to play into that future. This panel is going to take a little bit of a different approach. We're going to pull the lens back a few thousand feet here and talk about all of the change that's happening in the market, and using a term convergence to talk about how wireless operators and the mobile ecosystem in general is sort of shifting to meet the 5G future. Before we get started, I wanted to make a few announcements. First, Michelle Connolly, who is in the program as being on our panel, was unable to join us. She actually lives in Durham, North Carolina, and so she is in the path of Hurricane Florence, and so our thoughts are with her and with everybody in the path of Hurricane Florence. But one thing is clear about the mobile wireless operators, and if you saw the USA Today article, it was in the paper today about the preparations they've made in advance of Hurricane Florence. We fully expect that wireless will be there for them in the aftermath of the storm. Second announcement that I wanted to make, which is a little off topic, but one of the roles that I have at CTIA is focused on public safety. And I thought I'd use this platform as an opportunity to remind everybody, or at least make you aware, that next Thursday afternoon, September 20th, FEMA is going to be sending the first nationwide wireless emergency alert. This is a presidential level alert. It is a test message. It is going to be sent to every WIA-capable wireless device in the country at the same time, 2:18 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, September 20th. So make sure to tell your friends and your family. This is just a test message. No one is, hitting any buttons inadvertently. This is intentionally done. It is a presidential level alert. It's the first time we've done it. But I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And to the extent that you can, please use your platforms to amplify that message. So the best outcome that we have is that this is a non-event. No one's alarmed or surprised by this. And it's a good and positive demonstration of the power of the wireless emergency alert system. So with that, why don't we get started and move right into our panel, and I'll introduce them as we go along here. To my left is the White House's Telecommunications and Technology Policy Advisor. She's responsible for helping the U.S. advance technology and innovation priorities like broadband, spectrum, and transportation technology. So please welcome Kelsey Guyselman. To her left is AT&T's Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs. He's responsible for many of AT&T's commercial wireless priorities before the FCC, including spectrum and broadband regulation. Please welcome Hank Hultquist. To his left is the Managing Director of the Mobile Ecosystem. He's a monthly columnist in Wireless Week. He distributes his Lens on Wireless newsletter to comment on how the wireless industry is evolving. And he's been regularly advising wireless industry leaders for 25 years, including as a senior executive at Verizon Wireless. So please welcome Mark Lowenstein. And finally, to his left is the Managing Director at Raymond James & Associates, where he has his finger on the pulse of the wireless industry. Please welcome Rick Prentiss. So, as you can see, we've got a fully packed panel, and let's get into it. The first topic we want to talk about was sort of the dawn of 5G. We've spent basically 2 days now talking about all of the great things that 5G is going to bring. We could talk about the hundreds of billions of dollars that the industry is ready to invest and all the jobs it's going to create. But Hank, let's start with you. What's AT&T's vision for 5G?
Well, I think AT&T's vision for 5G is really a vision for what it can do for much of the rest of the economy. Because when I think, some of the things people talk about a lot with 5G, they talk about, higher speeds, lower latency, more capacity in the network. It's all kind of network engineering kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I think the real change that it will catalyze, I would say, is this acceleration toward new ways of organizing social and industrial systems and new ways of opportunities to do things that couldn't be done in the past. And in the last couple of days, we've heard a lot of these things. We've heard from leaders in transportation and healthcare, in a variety of things that people in our business call verticals. I love the way we come up with these terms. But really, to me, that's what 5G will do, that having the network that is, higher capacity, lower latency, edge computing, redesigned core of the network, I think all of that will contribute to really catalyzing changes in how some really critical functions of society are performed. And the most exciting part is seeing what people do with that, not what AT&T does with that, but what the rest of society, industry, different business models, how they evolve using these set of capabilities.
So let me throw out a term we heard today, the fourth industrial revolution. This is something that's a theme of Mobile World Congress Americas. Does AT&T agree that 5G is going to be ushering in the fourth industrial revolution?
I think AT&T has no official position on the fourth industrial revolution. And a small confession, until we started talking about this panel, I myself didn't really know what the fourth industrial revolution was, but I have done a little research and I've listened to a lot of the speakers here. My understanding is basically the fourth industrial revolution is building on the third, which was all about digital and computing power, and it's really a world where we'll start to see a greater fusion of those kinds of capabilities. And I mean, things people have talked about the last couple days, like AR and VR, I think are kind of critical components. And thinking about, I've heard people talking about how you can use AR, for instance, to help people who are out in the field doing technical work, repairs, all kinds of things. So I think, I certainly, now that I know what the fourth industrial revolution is, I do think that, I would say wireless in general is a force for it. And it's not like it's a binary thing. Today we don't have, wireless doesn't contribute, but 5G will. But I do think that 5G will accelerate it.
Well, let me bring in Mark and Rick. So Mark, when we start with you, what do you think the wireless industry is doing, both to differentiate themselves within the industry, but also to sort of be a platform, as Hank was saying, for this new revolution that we're going to be having?
Yeah, well, so first of all, what's really interesting is not just more wireless services in terms of faster and lower latency and so on, but now it's sort of getting into sort of broader industries. So with Verizon's announcement this week about fixed wireless, I mean, all of a sudden wireless is potentially a viable competitor in the broadband space. So it adds competition in the broadband space. That's, I think, really exciting. One aspect I think that hasn't really been discussed as fully as maybe would have been optimally, but is the spectral efficiency piece, and how much of a reduction in the cost it's going to be with all the changes in the networking and so on to deliver a gigabyte of data to a customer. And that's going to unleash not only this sort of idea of the fourth industrial revolution, but it's also going to really sort of change the cost structure of the industry, which I think is really powerful. And I think in terms of some of the apps, I think some of the most exciting things are going to be things that we don't see today. There are things we can see, like, for example, better broadband services and the AR and VR and some of the more consumer-oriented apps. When you sort of look at some of the IoT and some of the industrial aspects, it's sort of like when we launched LTE, you could sort of see that for the first time, mobile would be sort of a viable competitor in data and broadband, just in terms of offering a roughly equivalent service to what you could get in the home or the office in many respects. But it unleashed things. Uber is a great example of a capability or an application that takes full advantage of all the aspects that sort of wireless brings together. A broadband network, location capabilities, smartphones, the sort of app infrastructure, and I said that, and nobody would have envisioned Uber when LTE was launched in 2010, and so I think there'll be the same sorts of things, but maybe a little bit more on the industrial side.
So that's a really good point. The idea that there is one sort of application that sort of defines that era, right? And maybe Uber is the example that defines, what LTE and 4G really brought in terms of the ubiquity of coverage and the ability to get speeds that could enable certain applications. Rick, what are you seeing? Are you seeing a killer app here in 5G?
Well, having been around with Mark for a long time as well, we both grew up in the industry. Started at the age of 10, I think, both of us. It was easier. 1G was like voice. 2G was texting. 3G was data. 4G, I'd say more video,
Yeah.
It really allowed full motion video. 5G is alphabet soup. It is AR, VR, like Hank was saying. It's IoT, it's smart city, it's autonomous vehicles. It's a lot of stuff that changed. Maybe it's Blade Runner that just says, here's what the future looks like, and it's that big of a change to our societal way we operate. So that's in the use cases. So from the Wall Street perspective, we're trying to figure out where the revenues come from. And that's really, to Mark's point, we can't see around corners sometimes, and we're trying to figure out how do you monetize that. And investors look at the carriers and say, we see large capital spending continuing for many, many years. Where's the return on that capital? So I think that's where the differentiation is probably going to come in, is trying to figure out how to get smart that way. Automation, I think Hank kind of touched on that maybe a little bit too, that we think that'll be part of it. So it's going to be interesting. So 5G is really not as simple, I don't think, as our previous generations, because it's going to be so far-reaching.
So let me just stick with you two for a second here, because I think you are market prognosticators of where things are going, what's happening. This idea of how they're differentiating themselves. Could you drill down on that just a little bit more in terms of what are you seeing that are differences in how the companies are approaching what is 5G to them and how they're going to serve their customers?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, I think especially at this early launch stage, we're going to see quite a bit of differentiation, in part based on where the main operators own spectrum. So, for example, the Verizon fixed wireless service, they're the only ones who are launching a fixed wireless access service to the home using the 28 gigahertz band. So it's this initial service based on the millimeter wave band, which is very exciting to see how that's going to do. Not only how it's going to perform in different sorts of conditions and so on, but what sort of share they take in broadband in the markets where they launch, and it's going to be modest initial launch in terms of coverage. And then you have Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T, who are going to. AT&T is going to be launching in a gigahertz band as well, but T-Mobile's 5G service is going to be more of a coverage. It's going to be enhanced speeds and so on, but more of a coverage layer capability because it's using its assets at the 600 megahertz band. So some of these services will be based on how much spectrum they have, where the spectrum is in terms of what they can be delivering. And I think that's where you might see some differentiation in terms of the market orientation, the types of services that they offer.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, we had a summit recently, and some of the consensus amongst the carriers is 5G will probably ultimately be a plethora of bands you'll use as well. It's not just going to be one band. You're going to want low, mid, and high. And having three commissioners here today, I think, was a great coup for you guys. Clearly, I think this FCC gets it that we need to get more spectrum into the hands of the carriers. But I think you will see T-Mobile use the 600 because it's available, it's clear. If they merge with Sprint, get a better balance sheet, you can use some of that 2.5 to roll it out. You've got the 28 gig. You have a lot of auctions scheduled, which we're really glad to see these auctions. But the carriers were pretty consistent in saying their view of 5G is going to be every one of the bands, I'm going to need to throw it at it. It's not that it's only millimeter wave. It's going to be a multitude of bands. It's going to be a multitude of infrastructure. Macro towers will be involved, small cells will be involved, fiber will be involved. It's not that 5G equals millimeter wave, small cells. It's like you're going to need to throw the whole toolkit at it. Evolution, not revolution. We're going to see CapEx stay sustained but steady at these significant levels, not really spiking up or spiking down, but again, a commitment to keep spending is what it feels like to us. And that the fixed broadband is probably the biggest differentiator right now, is that Verizon talking about, particularly I think dense urban, probably multi-dwelling unit, saying, can we go right at a fixed operator and compete? Whereas the rest of the use cases will probably play out.
Great. Well, we certainly appreciate that the FCC is as focused as they are on getting additional spectrum out there for 5G. But Kelsey, the race to 5G, why is it important to the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think the race to 5G is something that's top of mind for many policymakers within the White House, and I think for a variety of reasons. There's obviously the economic impacts that we've talked about at length today and over the past 2 days. And you see that across the board, and not only the impact from the actual networks, but what they enable and what we'll see in terms of innovation in years to come. But I think the other aspect is the security considerations of it, and national security questions, both in terms of having an economic competitiveness internationally, but also making sure that we have the right standards in place and that things are deployed in a way that we have secure networks. And so these are both two things that I think will really drive the conversation about why it's so important for us to win the race to 5G. It's something that we're really tackling from a variety of different angles. And in fact, later this month, the White House will convene a group of stakeholders to have some additional dialogue about not only the opportunities and potential of 5G, but also the challenges that we face and how to be responsive to those challenges. And so it's something that really is being taken seriously across the board. And I think we've seen evidence of that in a lot of different areas. And so I think, I'm excited to see all of the different things over the course of the past 2 days here that we can come to expect if we do continue to lead the way to 5G.
That's great. I mean, having the administration focused on 5G in that way and bringing that kind of platform to it is going to be really helpful. What do you think, some of the topics that you might be discussing at this event, but overall, what do you think are going to be the keys to really achieving those two priorities you're talking about?
Sure. I think, there's certainly the obvious things like having forward-looking, flexible spectrum policy that will get spectrum into the hands of carriers and other users so that we have the sort of building blocks of 5G networks, and also in that same vein having smart infrastructure policy that enables the rapid deployment of these networks. Obviously, the denser networks are going to be a much different task for deployment than what we've seen in the past. And so that's something that's not only a federal issue, but also, of course, a state and local question. And then I think having the right investment environment is certainly important, making sure that companies feel that they have the certainty that they need to invest here. I think, as we've seen with the tax reform, that's certainly a priority. And then, of course, finally, just having that security conversation, that we're having policies in place that are flexible, that are nimble, that allow us to react and respond and recognize these new and emerging threats that we'll be seeing to the networks. And so these are all different building blocks, and I think there's a lot of other conversations to be had, particularly as we think about convergence, but I think those core principles will be what we need to tackle first.
So we're going to get to some of the discussion about what we think are the right, what's the right regulatory framework for this new environment where 5G is going to be the main platform for all this innovation and capability. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the term convergence, what that means. So I think everybody's probably saw today that the Wall Street Journal published an entire special section on what is 5G. And there was a particular section that jumped out to me where it talked about, and this goes, Mark, to your point, where wired and wireless technology is going to blur, or could blur, as wireless-centered companies pose new threats in markets dominated by cable companies, and so too could cable companies adopt the technology to compete. So from your perspective, Kelsey, what do you think? What is convergence, and why is this important to the U.S.?
I think it's really going to be important, and I think from a policy perspective, I like to think about it from the consumer point of view. And what does the consumer see and experience and expect when they're using these products? And I think the fixed wireless is a great example of this, where consumers don't really care how it gets into their home. It's just a matter of that it's in their home and it works. And so I think when we're talking about policy decisions, we need to be viewing it through that lens of how do we ensure that consumers have the best possible experience and access to the best technology. And certainly having more competition in that space is going to continually improve and force companies to compete with each other and be better and increase and improve the customer experience.
Well, Hank, let's pull you in here on this. So what do you think convergence is going to do for the consumer experience, as Kelsey was talking about? How does AT&T think that they're going to be delivering services for consumers there?
So AT&T, for the last several years certainly has put a huge amount of thought, time, effort, and just hard work into the idea that, especially with respect to content and video content, that what consumers want is the ability to access the content on any device at any time, wherever they are, whether it's on the 50-inch screen in their home or the 3-inch screen in their hands. And that really is from our perspective, that has been kind of the driver, poster child, whatever you want to call it, for convergence, and we've really focused on that. Then I would say, as what has gotten me, not AT&T, but me thinking about convergence lately, is watching the behavior of my 14-year-old son and the way he consumes Fortnite. And it really is fascinating. If you don't have kids, you may not be plugged into it, but there is an incredible sort of, I would say, convergent culture of gaming being built really largely on Fortnite. And he switches from the gaming console to his tablet to his phone, plays Fortnite across all the devices. And to me, like, I can see the tip of an iceberg here that says, when we really have 5G, imagine what that game could look like. And so that has got me thinking about convergence in a slightly different way. But again, I think it's consistent with the vision AT&T has had focused on video content.
So Fortnite is a RPG, shooter game, right? So maybe we did find the killer app for 5G. It's
Certainly
Fortnite.
for teenage boys
Yeah.
and girls. My daughter, actually, who's
Yeah.
12, she loves it too. So.
I've heard it's got a quite popular following. So Mark and Rick, why don't we turn to you guys on this question of how do you see the silos that were historically there between telecom, media, and technology sort of blurring and breaking down?
So I'll say two things on that. From the standpoint of the consumer, I mean, one question we should be asking, particularly as we're looking at fixed wireless access and so on, is whether in 5 or 6 years, the average household today spends some $400 between their cable bill and their wireless bill. Is that going to get consolidated? I mean, are you going to need, if you had 300 megabytes delivered to your house for $50 a month, would you, wirelessly, would you still have a broadband service, a broadband connection?
Right.
So, that could be an interesting example of convergence, and, that frees up spending for other things, and certainly could address a certain percentage of households. The other piece of it is the network convergence, is that as the telecom and the wireless networks evolve for 5G, oriented around the software and the cloud and the edge and all those sort of buzzwords you've been hearing all week and still trying to figure out whether you fully understand it, is that starts to look a lot more like the internet, sorts of networks that the Googles and the Netflixes and the Amazons are building, and so networks are also converging and becoming sort of much more programmable and software oriented, and that's where there's a huge amount of innovation going on, and some of the traditional radio-centric manufacturers and suppliers to the mobile ecosystem, like Nokia and Ericsson and so on, are full on in that direction. And the sorts of transformation that they've undergone in the past 2 or 3 years to be able to take that on has been pretty amazing to watch.
Rick, let's pull on some of the wealth of your experience here. So is this idea of convergence of these different companies getting into different lines of businesses, is this something new, or is this something we've seen before, but maybe this time it's a little bit different?
Yeah, so one thing is, first, just between wireless and wireline within telephone, AT&T and Verizon aren't really breaking that out anymore publicly, because it's hard to figure out what was for wireless and what was for wireline. If I'm
Right.
building fiber, was it fiber to the tower that enabled better wireless? So the ability to kind of decouple it at the company level has gotten tougher. So Wall Street is already starting to see this is converging wireline and wireless. Then you start saying, well, what about cable? How does cable come into this? I'm in the camp that thinks cable will find they need to do more than just have an MVNO agreement, that it's fairly expensive. Owner economics has a real reason it exists in economic theory, and that they may find, right now I think they're probably still studying, and we've seen cable flirt with wireless for many, 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 many years. Touch the toe and then back out, and touch the toe and back out. 4G was video, so that kind of created even a more incentive and imperative to probably start thinking of it. Have we seen it before? We can see it overseas. You see a lot of convergence happening in Europe. You see it happening in the Caribbean. A little more island-oriented, obviously the Caribbean, but also island-related in Europe, where you're kind of country-specific. So the U.S. is a bigger country, so it's probably taking a little bit longer. We don't have a nationwide cable company like some countries do, and nationwide landline company. But convergence makes sense also from a standpoint of, can I build my core network to support all these different applications? And so I think you will see over time that cable is going to be interested in saying, we need to be much more of a presence at these type of events. We'll see how Sprint T-Mobile plays out, but we think it certainly creates interesting competition when you have AT&T and Verizon and maybe a larger Sprint T-Mobile to say, hey, cable, where are you at? And don't you need your customers that are moving away from video to over the top and wanting to consume that anywhere, anytime, any device that Hank was talking about? So we think convergence will come. We've seen it already in Europe and the Caribbean.
So maybe the tectonic plates in the U.S. are starting to shift here in terms of how these companies are approaching delivering services for consumers, particularly taking advantage of the always-on, everywhere demand of particularly a new generation of folks who might be looking for that type of connectivity. Kelsey, can you help us here on the regulatory framework? Do we have the right framework in place for all this change?
So I think that Rick raises an interesting point about companies starting to consolidate their business models and no longer differentiating between wireless and wireline and things like that. Yet at the same time, our regulatory framework is still very much siloed in that way. And so I think that poses a challenge as companies try and become more forward-looking, yet they're still stuck in the regulatory structures of the past. And so I have concerns that that starts to slow or disincentivize some of this innovation that we're seeing. And I think it's critical that we continue to look at all of these regulations and whether they still make sense. And certainly there are some that will still make sense and that are going to be important no matter what the technology looks like, but I also think there are plenty that won't. And so I think having this continual conversation about what should we keep, what should we reconsider is going to be really important to make sure that we continue to attract and encourage the kind of innovation and investment that we've seen so far.
Do you see certain things happening amongst within the administration that are looking at that and kind of looking holistically at what's happening in the market?
Sure. I think in OSTP in particular, we have policy experts who tackle a whole host of different technology challenges, and we're seeing a lot of this in emerging technology, for example, in transportation, where you have these new and exciting developments in things like drones and autonomous vehicles, yet they're still bound by the regulations of the past that don't necessarily make sense. I know someone was talking to me about FAA regulations that require operators to have a harness on. Well, that's intended for when you're in an airplane or flying, when you're actually flying. But if you're operating a drone, do you still have to wear the harness on the ground? So
maybe.
Right, maybe you should. But I think we just have to really take a hard look at how do we ensure that we're protecting Americans, but not in a way that is sort of silly and outdated. And so I think that that's a conversation that's been happening frequently within the administration, and it's been really exciting that there are people who want to make those changes and are thinking about these problems in really new and novel ways.
So Hank, do you see any key principles that should be applied in a new regulatory framework, or do we have the right regulatory framework already for the environment we're in, or we're going into, I should say?
I certainly don't think I would say we have the perfect regulatory framework. But I think it's important to sort of think about a question like that in the context of actual issues, and I think it's helpful. And I think we do have, I believe there is a growing recognition around privacy and data that we need a single kind of framework that applies broadly on a nationwide level and achieves the objectives that we as a country think are appropriate to achieve with respect to privacy. And I think if we do that and we follow through on that and ultimately we achieve that, I think that then will iterate into another round of thinking about other regulatory issues, and can we apply the same kind of principles that we found useful in that I think we're finding useful now in that discussion about data and privacy. And so I think we're kind of getting ourselves onto a good road, but surely we're not there yet.
Well, let's take a step back and talk about why privacy is such a challenge right now, right? You've got what are essentially overlapping, potentially competing regulatory parameters, right? Coming from the international arena, from the GDPR, coming from the state level right here in California, and then potentially many proposals, even this week, for either best practices or principles, or proposals on the Hill for a federal framework. So, I guess from your perspective, how do you see those, looking at those different competing obligations potentially hindering or creating the predicate for what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience of companies is that the balkanization or the patchwork, whatever you want to call it, of multiple potentially overlapping, conflicting regimes cannot really be administered in a way that benefits consumers, that benefits the companies trying to do it, that we really need a broader framework than what you would have with that. And so I do think, like I said, I think putting the question into the context of the particular issue helps to illuminate what the right answer should be, I think. And not to say that there won't be disagreements about what the substance of the rules should be, but certainly the framework, that we should have a unified framework that applies broadly across the industries that are involved in the issue, and that is nationwide. I think there's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of recognition that that's the right approach.
So Kelsey, let's turn to you on this question. So drilling down on this issue of privacy, we've talked about the predicate here where you have these competing obligations. We've talked about silos breaking down amongst these companies. How is the administration looking at this and saying, at this issue, particularly from a consumer perspective?
Right. And I think Hank put it perfectly when he said it doesn't benefit consumers to have all of these different privacy regimes where they're not certain what they're subject to and what they're being protected from and what they should expect. And so I think that's really the concern, is creating this certainty for both consumers and for companies so that they know how to behave, so that they have the confidence that when they're sharing data that it's being protected and managed in a way that they're comfortable with. And so I think that having the conversation that David Ruddle brought up yesterday at NTIA and the Department of Commerce around how best to talk about privacy, what are sort of the core principles that we need to be thinking about in order to allow innovation to continue and allow data to be used in a productive and positive way, but also to make sure consumers have control over that kind of decision. And so it's a very complicated problem, and I think we're seeing that, again, both internationally and domestically. If it were easy, we would have solved it by now. But I know from my time on the Hill, there are a lot of different viewpoints about what the appropriate level of privacy protection is. And so that's something that I think we need to have a really thorough conversation about so that we can at least move in the right direction of whether best practices or principles or legislation or whatever the outcome may be of the process. But it's certainly something that consumers are demanding at this point. And I think that we as policymakers need to take that very seriously.
So Mark, let's bring you in on this. So the balkanization of potentially regulatory obligations as these companies are sort of breaking down these silos that we've been talking about, and Kelsey's point about the impact on consumers. How's the market looking at that? Do they see that as sort of a stumbling block potentially to achieving all the things that we want to in 5G?
Well, I think the market's adjusted for it a little bit. I mean, if you look at how, for example, the AT&T Time Warner deal, and that was approved, it was sort of thing that maybe the COM Act and sort of previous sort of the way the regulatory structure was set up might not have either sort of foreseen or necessarily sort of permitted, but I think the whole sort of change in industry structure and OTT and all of that and new players was a driving force. And one thing we might want to think a little bit about, as it nears the 25th anniversary, I think it goes back to 1996, is the Communications Act, and whether it might make sense to be thinking about revisiting that at some point. Because there are some very different factors out there. It did not really envision OTT. It didn't really envision mobile broadband. It didn't really envision the movement of networks to sort of the edge and data centers and the cloud. There's a whole bunch of things that have changed that would have been impossible to foresee back then, that are sort of important enough and sort of game-changing enough that it merits if not a complete sort of revisiting of the act, certainly significant amendments or whatever the term might be. And that would be, an interesting discussion to start, and then maybe we bring in some of those privacy issues into that envelope as well.
Yeah.
First, from the Wall Street perspective, I think we are encouraged that the administration and the FCC, Chairman Pai gave a great speech at the infrastructure show in Charlotte with this whole Talladega Night references that were, I think, brilliant, that the world is moving fast, and as regulators, we need to move fast. And historically, Wall Street has looked at regulation as being rear view mirror. And maybe we can get to the side mirror. It's like windshield, that's where we need to be because the world is moving fast. And so we're really happy to hear the administration and the FCC saying, we get it. We need to help make America strong with our 5G, lead the world with it, and that forward-looking, forward-acting regulatory can help. That said, the other thing Wall Street likes is for companies to have some certainty about if I spend money, how am I going to make a return on that? And that's a key item, that if rules bounce around too much, how do you put big chips to work with big bets, not knowing? So forward-looking is critical because the world's moving fast, but having some certainty to understanding what the rules are and how I'm going to make a return, absolutely critical.
So Mark set us up with this question about the COM Act. So why don't we go there? The question, so play a little game here, right? What's one thing you would keep and one thing you would change in the COM Act? And I won't put Kelsey on the spot first, so we'll go the opposite way and start with Rick.
The thing I would keep is the Telecom Act in '96 is what led me from Bell South to Wall Street, so I would keep that because it was confusing to people. They were trying to figure out what does this mean, and having built networks, financed networks around the globe, it was a good time to make the change. I think net neutrality is clearly something that has to come on the table. That to avoid the elephant in the room, we've got to look at that and just say what is happening. We've had meetings with regulators several years back where it felt like the pendulum had swung heavily regulatory-wise to support one industry sector. And was that right? Could you earn the right returns? Apparently not, right? We're seeing some toughness there. So I think that's an item. And what a great phrase, net neutrality, but was it really neutral? So you have to think through what's fair to be able to make sure the infrastructure gets built, and there's incentives in a capital-oriented marketplace that people will earn their returns. So I think that's part of what a Telecom Act would need to address is there's capital that has to be spent, but there's returns that have to be made.
Mark, you brought it up.
So one thing I would keep is a clear recognition of those who are spending real money, putting real facilities in the ground to build networks, and make a distinction between those who are building networks and those who are riding on them. Because you also have to recognize, there's guys who are spending billions of dollars a year, very consistently in the wireless industry, close to 20% of revenues on capital expenditure. The Netflixes and the Amazons and the Googles of the world are not. So we have to think a little bit about that in this new construct. And one thing I would also maybe, sort of get rid of is not the right word, but maybe just think about is rules around resale. You've got a company like Dish, which is sitting on all this spectrum. You think about how that might be utilized. I would love to see somebody go out and build a honkin' wholesale network that other third-party providers and innovators could utilize to offer innovative services and see more competition in broadband and sort of innovative business models, which we've seen in some other countries actually in a little bit more of a way than we see here. And so I think that's something you could do within the construct of a revisiting of that act and just a bit slightly different regulatory framework.
Interesting. Hank?
So I love these conversations.
Yeah.
So what if we could change the 96 Act? Great idea. But I would say first of all, the Act is really built around the opposite of convergence in many ways. It's built around a thought process that was non-convergence. And so, but I think there's one aspect of the Act that sometimes we lose sight of, and at the time it seemed it really was, even more than conventional wisdom. I think people really accepted this idea that the right approach to regulation is to, where regulation is appropriate, where there are identified market failures, but in general, the policy is to seek to allow competition to deliver value to consumers. And that kind of big picture philosophy, I think whatever framework we have, it's really important that we retain that. That you know, we don't regulate for fun or for the sake of regulating. We regulate to solve actual failures. And in general, our presumption is that competition will adequately, you know, deal with issues to protect consumers. And so I think that would be the most important thing to retain going forward, that notion of kind of there's a humility about regulation, and its circumstances are in which we rely on regulation rather than the market are limited. And then the rest of it, I honestly think, because the act, if you had the opportunity to do it again, because it really was the opposite of convergence, you would get rid of a lot of the specific, you know, things that were in it because they're just not relevant anymore.
And especially as we're moving to this new environment. Kelsey, you spent a little time on the Hill thinking about this. So.
Yes. So I think one thing that I think is really important to keep is the concept of universal service and access for all Americans. I think, you know, Hank makes a good point that certainly competition should drive regulatory policy, but there are places where there is a recognized market failure or no business case, and we need to not lose sight of the fact that, you know, we have millions, 39 million Americans, I believe, that don't have access to high-speed broadband, and that's something that's just unacceptable. And so I think we need to continue to prioritize that. And then I think from the what to get rid of, I think just the structure, I think is, again, not to use Hank's point, but it's really, it doesn't make sense to have either conflicting or different regulatory schemes for different technologies that frankly now do the same thing.
And this is the challenge with regulation, right? Designing something around a market as it existed at the time. And here we are, you know, 22 years later, and things have changed pretty significantly and are poised, if we really are entering the fourth industrial revolution, to change even more. So we'll wrap it up with this final question with, what do you think we're going to be talking about if we come back together as a group next year? What are we going to be talking about? Maybe Fortnite? Is that where we're going?
Probably.
Fortnite's taking over everything?
But, so I would, is it okay if I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think part of what we'll do next year is kind of a report card. You know, here's what we said last year, here's what we thought. Let's see how the actual real world experience, you know, matches up to that. So I think we'll do a little bit of that. I think we'll do a little bit of, here's the next phase, because, you know, 5G, whether we're talking about from the standards are still, there are going to be more releases of the standards, that there are going to be further deployments. So I think we'll be talking about what's next. And I'm hopeful that we'll have more, not just the network, but more of the stuff that we were talking about earlier of people figuring out, and look what I did with 5G, you know? It's not just that 5G is there, it's I did something really cool, and it might be Fortnite.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll jump on it. Hopefully we're talking about more meat on the bones of the use cases. That right now, the engineers are still doing their work. They're trying to figure out how millimeter wave makes it through all these e-glass and windows and other stuff. But hopefully we move beyond just the engineering challenges of rolling out 5G, but the marketing departments working with the verticals that Hank loves to call it, doesn't, that we're actually seeing some real use cases with some meat on the bones about what is this going to do? And how do I touch and feel about it? And what of that alphabet soup is actually starting to happen first, and how do we move on? That's what I'd hope.
I'll put two things out there. They have a common denominator of three, the number three. Number one is, if things go well in the next year with 5G and some of these initial deployments, we're going to be having a pretty serious discussion about how do we get the 300,000 cell sites deployed that we really need to roll out, you know, coverage fairly comprehensively across the different bands, because those are the sort of numbers that are being floated around, and there's good discussion going on and progress being made, but that's, you know, it's going to intensify. The other thing is, And I think it was a study that the CTIA released about the number of jobs that are going to be created by 5G. I think the number was 3 million or so.
Yep.
I think we might be needing to have a conversation about do we have the right educational structure, in university programs and so on, to train all the people who are going to be required to fill those 3 million jobs, because a lot of those are going to be in software engineering. You think about whether it's all the antenna stuff or the edge computing, or all the requirements are going to be on the technical side for 5G, and then what's beyond, and the evolution of networking and so on, and whether we are have the right programs in place and enough of them to create to fill the number of jobs that are going to be open in those areas. Because I have discussions with operators, I have discussions with some of the folks on the network side who are clearly concerned about that. And we want a lot of those jobs to come from the U.S. To be generated here. So
Hopefully we'll be talking about how America won the race to 5G next year. No, I'm hopeful that we'll have good conversations about the successful deployments in the U.S. and what's next.
Good. Well, yeah, if I had to make a prediction, I think we will still be talking about spectrum and infrastructure. But here, I think we've had a good discussion about, that we're at an inflection point, really, with the industry. We are moving to something that's very exciting and new, and we don't all yet know exactly what all the use cases are going to be, but next year we might have things a little bit more, the crystal might be a little bit more clear. So until next year, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to Mobile World Congress America.